Welcome to the very first episode of Business Logic. I'm your host, Andy Chin.
It's an idea as old as the earth itself. For the longest time, what people did was start businesses. People found a way to provide value to others in their tribe or others in their society, and they would, basically sell whatever they were making or trade it.
That's my guest on today's show, Courtland Allen. Courtland is the founder of indiehackers.com, a community for founders, mostly developers, who run independent businesses to share their stories and exchange tactics with each other. I personally really loved having this conversation with Courtland. I think he's super thoughtful and jam-packed with insights. He also gives a lot of counterintuitive advice, like pointing out things that venture capital funded startups should follow, but doesn't necessarily apply to the indie hacker business. For example, we talk a little bit about picking a market, and he says that picking a competitive market is not necessarily a bad idea. Whether you have an interest in running a business of your own someday, or maybe you already do, either way, I think that you'll find what Courtland has to say to be very interesting. So, on to the show. Courtland Allen, welcome to Business Logic.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Andy.
So, for those in the audience who aren't familiar, why don't we talk about, first of all, what is Indie Hackers?
Indie Hackers is a community of people, mostly developers, who are interested in building things and making money by selling those things online. It's not really your traditional startup type crowd. These aren't people who are looking to find investors. It's not about raising a bunch of money. It's not about having an office with lots of fancy perks. It's more about just putting your technical skills to use, making something that you like, and changing your own life. And so most indie hackers are in this because they want some form of financial independence, financial freedom, control over when they work or where they work or what they work on. And the goal usually is financially motivated as well. So people want to basically replace their incomes or supplement their incomes at the very least, or at most, become wealthy.
That's really interesting. So who are the indie hackers, and indie hackers all lowercase? What tends to motivate them based on what you've seen?
All sorts of stuff. Indie hackers can be pretty much anyone. And I think what motivates them depends heavily on what level they're at. So I just talked to Natalie Nagel, for example. Her and her husband, Chris, have been working on their business since 2002 or something. They're coming up on their 20-year reunion. They've been profitable since pretty much the beginning. They've got dozens of products that they've launched over the years. They've started products. They've sold some. They've shut some down. Some make millions in revenue. They have lots of employees. And I think for them, it's really about having a great lifestyle for them and their kids. And it's also about having an impact on their employees' lives and on the world at large. I think for more fledgling indie hackers, let's say you're a developer at a job, you're probably not so focused on how can I change the world. You're more focused on how do I supplement my income? How do I potentially quit my job and go to work for myself? And there's a whole gamut of outcomes and desires in between those two extremes.
Yeah, I mean, you seem to describe quite a spectrum there. I mean, on the one hand, you have someone who's got a full-time job and they spend nights and weekends working on some sort of side project. And on the other hand, you describe someone who has employees and, has real people accountable to them. So it really spans quite a lot. Are all of those people indie hackers?
I would say they're all indie hackers. If your goal is to basically be the person responsible for your own income, I would say that you're an indie hacker. Now, that's obviously a loose definition. There's some gray area around the edges. Like, are you not an indie hacker if you raise money? Are you not an indie hacker if you're not a developer? I wouldn't go so far as to say that you're not, but I think you're not an indie hacker if your goal is basically to derive all of your income from an employer. If there's some middleman between you and the customer that you're building a product for, and that middleman is basically taking a cut and paying you a salary, then you're not an indie hacker. Everybody else kind of is.
You started this community website in 2017?
2016.
2016.
Joined Stripe in 2017.
Right. Is this a new idea, this indie hacking thing, or did it precede the website?
It's an idea as old as the earth itself, Andy. For the longest time, what people did was start businesses. People found a way to provide value to others in their tribe or others in their society, and they would, basically sell whatever they were making or trade it for some goods in return. I think this concept got sort of lost somewhere along the way in the digital internet age, where investors sort of started driving the narrative. And so if you're an investor, you basically only care about companies that are going to increase in value in the future because that's how you make money. If you are a venture capitalist, which is a certain breed of investor, then you not only care about companies that are going to make money in the future, but you care about companies that are going to make 100 times as much money in the future, or 1,000 times, because you want a huge return on your investment. And since these people control so much money, they also garner the most media attention. They're involved in the most significant tech companies. And I think there's just a lot of glory heaped on that path where it's not the only path. And at some point it became, in many people's eyes, the only path. What you have to do if you want to be a startup founder or a tech founder or start a business online is go big. You have to raise a ton of money. You need to be the only winner in your space. You need to be Facebook or Twitter. And if you're not, then you're just a joke. You're a lifestyle business. It's not really how business is done. I think that's kind of ridiculous. The vast majority of all businesses that have ever been started, even online, aren't good candidates for venture capital, but yet still improve the lives of the people who started them, the people who work for them, the people who use them. And that's totally a legitimate model. So indie hackers have existed forever, well before the term indie hackers was ever coined.
Wow. So why do you think it is? And I know we're starting to speculate a little bit, but why do you think it is that we stopped talking about the indie hacker? Or what is it about the internet that, from my perspective, maybe I spend too much time in the Bay Area, but from my perspective, there are only companies that you work for and companies that you start that are extremely well funded.
Right.
What happened in the middle?
God, I remember moving to the Bay Area. I wanted to be a startup founder myself. And I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, so the South, much slower pace there, much less money changing hands in Snellville, Georgia than there is in Silicon Valley. I remember getting into Y Combinator and talking to some other founders about another founder who had sold his company. And I think he sold his company for like a couple $1 million. And we were all going to sit there and talk about it. And I remember being so excited and happy for him. Like, that's crazy. I wish I could do the same thing. And before I could speak, everybody in the group started hating on this guy and saying, wow, he really sold out. He just wanted to run a lifestyle business, et cetera, et cetera. Keep in mind, none of these people's businesses were making any money whatsoever. No one had any sort of success. But I was kind of mystified. Like, how can you, like, that's a life-changing amount of money. Good for him, How did we get away from the point where a normal business or even lots of money started seeming like a good accomplishment? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the internet is sort of an aggregator. If you think about your corner store is not necessarily any better than any other corner store, but you still go to it and it still stays in business because it can only serve the people on your corner. It has really no competition. Whereas on the internet, if you have a website, there's nothing stopping anybody from putting in the URL to your competitor's website. And so ultimately, what tends to happen is the best websites win. And those websites get 99.9% of the attention, and the other websites basically don't. And so we start to glorify, winner-take-all markets. We start to glorify companies like Facebook, which owns social networking, and companies like Google, which owns search. And I think when you heap all your focus on just a small number of winners, it's really easy to forget that there's a ton of medium-sized businesses out there, far more than there are these massive winners that you just don't really hear about.
So I caught a little bit about your background in there. Sounds like you started a Y Combinator company.
Yes.
And Y Combinator loves those big outcomes.
They do.
Those big venture-funded outcomes. So I'm curious, how did you go from that life to the one you're living now, where it seems like you're espousing the bootstrap life? And for those in the audience who aren't familiar, the word bootstrap means to be funded by yourself or perhaps at most your friends and family.
Yeah, or your business's own revenue. So you're pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. It was a long journey, although even before I got into Y Combinator, I was already leaning towards, hey, I'm going to be happy if I just, make a decent amount of money and I can go from there, right? I was young. I think I was 23 when I got into Y Combinator. It wasn't like this has to be how I spend the rest of my life. But the biggest influences on me at the time were Paul Graham, the creator of Y Combinator, who is a very level-headed guy. He started this accelerator to basically help people with high growth startups achieve their dreams, build unicorn companies, although nobody was saying the word unicorn back then. But at the same time, he wasn't a zealot about it. He wasn't like, you have to go this path, there is no other path. He was an investor, he had his biases, but he was totally reasonable about the fact that everybody wanted to do their different things. And so during Y Combinator, he would invite different people to speak. And this is where I met another one of my role models, who was Kevin Hale. So Kevin Hale had been a YC founder himself in previous years. He started a company called Wufoo. And then instead of raising a ton of money from investors and staying in the Valley, he promptly, after YC ended, packed up shop as co-founders. They moved to a town in Florida. They hired a lot of remote workers. They started charging money for the product that they built. It's an online form builder. And they shared the profits with their employees, which I thought was fascinating. So when Kevin Hale came to talk, after hearing so many other high-growth startup founders talk, hearing him talk about how they were charging money and making something like $5 or $6 million a year. They had happy, rich employees as well, and they were going at a relaxed pace. They didn't feel any pressure to live up to investor expectations. That sounded like a dream come true to me. So he was maybe my second role model. And another one of my role models was Jason Fried, and I guess his partner, David Heinemeier Hansen, who ran a company that was called 37 Signals at the time. Now it's called Basecamp. And they were always big proponents of basically bootstrapping your company and charging money for what you were building. Keep in mind, this is 2011, 2010. This is way before it was popular to charge money. Stripe didn't even exist. You couldn't really easily charge money for the products that you built online. The biggest startups at the time were startups that had no business model in sight, companies like Facebook and Twitter. Investors considered it folly for you to charge money. So what they were saying was completely out of left field. What Kevin Hale was doing was completely out of left field. Nowadays, you don't see that so much anymore. The biggest unicorn companies, Stripe, Uber, Airbnb, Instacart, all these companies all have very clear business models. They've made money from day one. And so I think people have kind of come around. And I did the same. I went from being in YC myself and saying, okay, well, I'm kind of interested in this other path, to becoming really interested in it and sort of disillusioned with the VC funnel, I'll call it, where VCs want to invest in 100 companies and they don't care if 99 of them fail as long as one is the next Uber. And it's a happy story if you're the VC, but it's not a great story if you're one of those 99. So I think I became disillusioned with that path and thought, I, as an individual developer, have the skills to build something. I'm also a designer. I can design something. I can put it online. I can market it and try to get people to pay for it. And I don't need that many people paying me $20, $50 a month for me to be able to pay for my salary and make a living. And then I can go from there and decide what I want to do with my life.
That's really great. I think, unfortunately, I'm starting to hear that sort of a story more and more often. That is someone who really worked extremely hard on a venture-backed startup, got burnt out, and got a little bit disillusioned with the VC and funding ecosystem. And so I think I'm starting to hear more and more of the narrative that you're saying, that charging money is cool again. And that
It really is.
Yeah, it's back in style. Thankfully, that's starting to lead more people to start more sustainable businesses and have, healthier lives. Would you say that your job as, creative indie hackers, you and your brother really, would you say that your jobs are to spread the gospel, to make more people become indie hackers?
I would say so. I think it's important for more people to become indie hackers, not because it's somehow a better life, not because going the other path and being an employee is somehow wrong. I'm a software engineer myself. I've gone down that path, but because I think a lot of people don't become founders. A lot of people don't become indie hackers in a way that's sort of a disservice. It's because they don't know about it, because they're not aware of the opportunity, because it seems more intimidating than it really should, because there is no golden path laid out by society saying, here's exactly how you start a business. If you think about what it's like to be a kid growing up in the US, what you hear is you need to get good grades and then go to a good college and then get good grades there and then get good at interviewing so you can get a good job at a company, and then you need to get good performance reviews and rise through the ranks in your company. And that is sort of the golden path. And it's really easy to stay on a path. But I think that path is just a story. It's a story told to us by society. It's a story told to us by, quite frankly, the people who are running these businesses. And it's not necessarily any more true than the story that we could be telling ourselves, that, hey, you can own your own time. You can own your own means of income. You can be a business yourself. And I think, quite frankly, most employees already kind of are businesses. If you think about what it is to be an employee, you're pretty much doing all the same things that a business does, but it's been rebranded in this way to make you think that you're not. And so you might say, oh, I've really got to prep for these interviews. I've got to do well in my interview. Well, what is an interview if it's not sales? Every business has to do sales. Every business has to convince customers to buy what it's selling. As an employee, if you are going through an interview, you're just selling your services to a company. That company is your customer. You can call them your employer if you want, but they're really your customer. And the process of interviewing is really just trying to convince them why they should hire you, right? Why they should buy your services over your competitor's services, which is other engineers or other people applying for the same job as you. And so I think, I could extend this analogy in 100 different ways. Pretty much everything you do as an employee is basically the same thing that you do as a business, but called some different name. And the downside to it, I think, is that as an employee, you get paid really just for your time. You can be a software engineer and you can create $10 million of value for Google in a year, and you'll be paid $200,000, which is a great salary. You shouldn't complain about that. You're super lucky to have that salary, but at the same time, you're not really getting paid commensurate to the value that you're creating. And there's other execs at Google who really are. And so I think it's kind of a shame to live in a world where everyone is sort of told these stories about what role they play. and these stories aren't very accurate. And so I think I see my role as being to help more people realize that, like, hey, you probably have the skills to start a business. You're doing all the things you need to do to start a business already. You just need to somehow like shift your mindset a little bit, and then you can do whatever you want. You can work on something that you enjoy working on, perhaps, rather than working on something that your boss or your company tells you have to work on. You can work with your friends or your family members rather than working with sort of random employees who happen to get hired. You might be able to work from wherever you want on whatever schedule you want, rather than having to clock in at a certain time and being expected to work 9 to 5, et cetera. So I think there's lots of benefits for people to become indie hackers, and it's not as hard as many might think. Still hard, but it's not as hard.
See, that's the thing that gives me pause, is that everything you're saying, this life that you describe of freedom and wealth on your own terms, sounds awesome. But if I'm on the fence, like maybe give me a sample highlight of your favorite indie hacker stories, or people who made the jump who were uncertain or on the fence like I am right now.
Yeah. Probably the best stories to read if you're uncertain are people who are more similar to you, basically people who are working a full-time job and just sort of dip their toe in the water. Maybe they started a side project and then grew from there. The alternative is people who quit full-time and go, hardcore in their business, which can be really risky and scary, especially if you have a family, a mortgage, et cetera. So some of my favorite stories of people doing this, Mike Parham. So Mike Parham is the creator of basically an open source library called Sidekick. For the technical among you, it's a background job processor for Ruby. And Mike was working as an engineer at a company when he made this open source project. And he just kind of worked on it nights and weekends while he was working his full-time job. And then he was able to justify using this open source project on his full-time job. So now he was working on it at work as well as at home. And then he started charging money for a pro version of Sidekick. And so he was able to sort of ease himself out of his job without taking any sort of massive risk. And I've seen that story play out time and time again. Some other indie hacker stories that I particularly enjoy. A good friend of mine, her name's Lynn. I've had her on my podcast. She lives in San Francisco. And she started a business literally because she was reading indie hackers and reading about all these stories and felt antsy. She was a contract web developer. So she was basically making websites for all sorts of different startups and SF. And as such, she was in a really good position to experiment because she just had control of her time already. I think being a contractor in a lot of ways is a middle ground between starting your own business and being a full-time employee, where you really are an employee in a way, but you also have to find your own clients and contracts might end and you sort of start to see yourself as a business in a way that most employees don't. So she was in that position and she decided that she wanted to start a startup. And one of the things that she noticed is that when she had earlier on applied for full-time jobs as a developer, she really hated the process. She thought the process was super opaque. She had to jump through so many hoops of sending in cover letters and resumes and going through interview after interview before she could even find out if this is a company that she wanted to work at because she liked the people and the culture and the vibe, et cetera. And so she started a business to sort of flip that on its head. Her business is called Key Values. It's a pretty simple website. You go there as a developer. You are presented with a sort of tag cloud of different and tangible values that companies might have, right? So the company might value emotional intelligence over IQ, or they might be very light on meetings, or they might really value high performers and be sort of a hardcore place to work. There's like 40 of these values. They might eat lunch together, they might exercise together, et cetera. And so you just sort of check the boxes of which ones you care about. And then the search results will show you companies that have picked these as their top values. Out of all the ones they could choose, companies have picked these and they've explained why they embody those values. And so Len makes something like $350,000 a year, 2 years after starting this business.
Wow.
By herself. She doesn't have any employees. It's just her. She was working like 20 hours a week from home. She's kind of an outlier. Like there's not a whole ton of success stories that are that extreme, but she's not that rare. I've been able to interview 3 new indie hackers every week without trying that hard to find a ton of them every week since I started this business in 2016. So there's quite a few stories out there.
That's super awesome. I especially like the name Key Values.
It's a great name.
It's for developers. It's your key values. It's great.
She spent a week thinking up the name.
Oh, it's perfect. And yeah, I happen to be personally a big fan of the indie hacker stories, so I'll be sure to link the stories for both Lynn and Mike in the show notes for people who want to listen to those stories. But that is awesome. So I'm on board. I feel like I should start a side project. Before I really make the leap and quit my job, I just want to know, on a broad sense, what are the businesses that tend to work? What sort of business should I start? And you can break this down in terms of the business model, like how should I bill people? Maybe in terms of customer segments, like what are customer segments that tend to buy things? What would you recommend? Should I sell to consumers?
There's a lot of ways to slice this question, as you're hinting at. Where do I even start? Okay, so business theory 101, like you want to provide something of value that people will pay for, and you have to also recognize the situation that you're in. How much money do you have saved up in the bank? Are you going to be quitting your job cold turkey? Are you going to be working on the side? You're probably going to have a lot of constraints that sort of force your hand in terms of what kind of business you even can build. It's hard to say where you should start, but the broad strokes are that, in my opinion, you should start very small. You should start with something that's very simple that you can fit into your nights and weekends and build in a few weeks rather than 6 months or 12 months of slaving away. You should start by building something that you're personally interested in, because the number one reason founders quit, quite frankly, is that they're not interested in what they're building. Things get frustrated. If you're frustrated trying to work on something that you don't particularly care about, you're going to quit. And that's why your business is going to die. I won't say necessarily, but probably sell to other businesses. Businesses are quite counterintuitively easier to sell to. Businesses have a lot more money. It's easier for them to understand what kind of purchases will basically increase their revenue or help them save money and time. And so they're more likely to make big expenditures, whereas consumers will spend lots of money on different things, but like not that many different things. Consumers spend a lot on housing, on transportation, on education. Outside of like those and a few other categories, it's pretty hard to make money selling to consumers. Consumers are pretty fickle. So I would say for most new founders, you're better off selling to businesses. You're better off doing something where you can take a sales-based approach rather than a marketing-based approach. Sales is great because it requires you to talk to people one-on-one. And when you talk to people one-on-one, they give you feedback. They say, no, I'm not going to buy this app that you made, and here are the reasons why. Whereas if you have a marketing-based approach, if your goal is, hey, I'm just going to build an app, not talk to anybody, put it online, and people will show up. They'll come from whatever website I submit it to, or they'll find it on Google. Maybe they will show up. If you're lucky, you put a lot of work into the marketing. But then when they decide not to buy whatever it is you built, you're not going to know why. Because you're just going to see a visitor on your Google Analytics who came and then bounced, and you'll never know why. So I think it's a lot easier to basically iterate on what you're building and improve quickly if you've got a sales-based approach. Now, I get into more specifics, like what should you build? Like how do you hit all these criteria? Build something that's quick, that's sales-based, that you're passionate about. There is no shortcut. Like there isn't a magical formula that's going to work for everybody, but I've seen certain business models that tend to do very well. I've seen a lot of founders start by picking an area that they're interested in, figuring out some common problem that people in that area have, doing a lot of research and compiling information to put basically the solution to that problem online in one place in content form, and then selling ads once they start attracting people. So I'll give you a couple examples. Nomad List is a site created by this guy, Peter Levels. Peter Levels is a digital nomad. He loves traveling the world, working from all sorts of different places. Guess what? Lots of other people love doing that same thing too. One of the problems that you have as a digital nomad is that research is terrible. You have to figure out what city you want to go to, what the internet speed is going to be like, whether or not it's safe, how expensive it is. Are there other digital nomads there? It's a whole bunch of research. It takes hours and hours and hours, weeks and weeks to figure out where you want to go. And even if you do a lot of research, you're probably missing out on the best places. So he's like, you know what? I'm going to do this research for people. I'm going to do all this research. Instead of just using it for myself, I'm going to pull it all in one spreadsheet. I'm going to crowdsource it and get other people to contribute as well. Then he took that spreadsheet and put it onto a website. And so now he created like basically the world's best resource for being a digital nomad and learning all this information that you would otherwise have to research on your own. So now that he had the traffic from all these digital nomads who were coming to his resource, he sold advertisements to basically any company that wanted to sell their products to digital nomads, right? Any travel company, backpack companies, airlines, hotels, etc. So ultimately, he sort of followed all the rules that I specified. He did something he was interested in. He started with something small. It was a Google spreadsheet at first. It was super tiny. It wasn't any complex, over-engineered thing. It didn't even require any code to get started. He sold to businesses. It was free for these consumers. Like digital nomads are just random consumers. There's there's really no guarantee they're going to pay for anything that you build, anything that you code. But other businesses who already have a business model and who already are making money and can afford to pay easily agreed to pay him for advertisements. Like I think in his first week, he got inbound requests where people were saying, hey, I want to advertise on your site. How do I do that? And it was a sales-based approach. When you're selling ads, you have to actually talk to people and tell them how much money you're going to charge them to put an ad on your site, and they have to tell you what it's going to look like, et cetera, and how much they'll pay. And so he was able to adjust his business model over time based on these conversations he was having. So I think that's a pretty good example of one of the more popular types of business models that indie hackers start with.
So this is business logic, where the name of the game is getting really in the nitty-gritty and the tactical stuff. So I really want to dive on this question because I feel like this is the most paralyzing question of them all. Like, what idea should I start with? I'm really stuck here. So maybe to help us out a little bit, maybe you could tell us about business ideas that sound good on paper, but in practice always turn out bad. Like if you're in university, everyone has that idea for that campus note-taking app.
Yes.
Because they're in university and that's the one problem that they have. And of course, inevitably, it goes poorly.
Right.
So what's the indie hacker version of that?
Probably the indie hacker version of the campus note-taking app is the to-do list app, which is every developer's dream. If you're a developer, you're like, I have to track my tasks and all the things I'm working on. I know exactly how to code my own to-do list app. Other people need to use to-dos too. So I'm going to build a to-do list app. I'm then going to charge $5 a month from it. And once I get 2,000 customers, I'll be set. I'll make $10K a month. I can quit my job. I'll be fine. There's a lot of things that are wrong with that approach. The first thing that's wrong with it is that you're probably trying to sell to consumers. Consumers specifically don't want to spend a lot of money, which is why you end up saying, oh, I'll charge, a few bucks a month, $5 a month for this app. And if you're going to charge $5,000 a month for your app, then you really do need 2,000 paying customers, which is a crazy high amount of paying customers. For most businesses, especially consumer-based businesses, only 1% of people who ever see what you built will pay for it. And so if you're trying to sell 2,000 licenses to this to-do list app that you built, you need 200,000 people to use your app, which is a tall order. It's it's impossible to get on the phone and call up 200,000 people. My friend Len, who I spoke to earlier, she has something like 60 customers and she's making $350K a year. She can get on the phone and talk to 60 customers in a week if she really wants to and she wants to work all day. You can't do that if you're charging $5 a month. So I think that's kind of one of the canonical bad business ideas. Generally speaking, any business idea where as a developer, you're just excited to build the thing and that's the number one thing that's driving you. Hey, I really want to build this product is probably going to be a bad business idea. The fact of the matter is, just because you build something doesn't mean people are going to find it useful. And just because people find something useful doesn't mean that they're actually going to pay you money for it. If you really want to come up with an idea that you think is going to be valuable, that people will like and pay for, my recommendation is to look where money is exchanging hands already. Right? What are people already paying for? That's the biggest signal that people are interested in something to begin with. So people pay for advertising, right? Businesses care about growth. Every business wants to grow its revenue. So businesses pay for ads. So if you can have an ad-based business model, that's great. People pay for transportation. People pay for education, selling any sort of course. If you can tell people, hey, if you take this course or you read this book or you read this guide, it will give you skills that will help you make more money at your job, people will pay you for that because they can understand how that's going to benefit them. Hiring developers, companies pay so much money to hire developers. That's why Key Values makes so much money because she's injected herself into this place where lots of money is changing hands. There's just a ton development tools. Companies pay a lot for laptops, for IDEs, for software that helps them write code, anything that helps people be more productive. What's funny is a lot of this sounds boring. This is kind of the opposite of the question you asked. You said, what business ideas sound good that aren't? Well, what business ideas sound bad that actually are good? Oftentimes, entering a really crowded market where it seems like there's a lot of people already making money is the best idea. And you might say, oh, well, there's so much competition. Why would I do that? And it's well, the fact that there's a lot of competition is a really good sign for you as an indie hacker because that means a lot of people can coexist in this industry and all thrive, which is kind of the industry you need to be in if you're just this one person getting started with no advantages. And so I would say if you're looking for an idea, try to find the intersection of what you're interested in and what people are already paying lots of different companies lots of money to do.
That's super counterintuitive to, potentially competition is actually a good sign.
Yeah.
Whereas we're told from day one, competition is bad. That's where profits get eaten away. So does that mean I should start a social network? Because there's a ton of money changing hands like Facebook. Look at that market cap. Maybe I could potentially get some of that.
It's a good question. I think the answer to this is also somewhat counterintuitive. You can start a social network. You would think, okay, I can't start a social network. That's a terrible idea. You probably don't want to start a social network by trying to be everything to everybody. You don't want to start a very general purpose social network. But in a lot of ways, Nomad List, the site that I referenced earlier, is now a social network. It's a social network of digital nomads. It's got a forum. People create profiles. They talk to each other. They message each other on the site. Indie Hackers, my own community, is a social network of people trying to start these online indie businesses. There are dozens of social networks online that all make money. It's not a terrible idea to start a social network. And I think the fact that it's a crowded space and there are lots of social networks doesn't necessarily detract. You just need to find your niche within that crowded space. You can't just do the same thing that literally everybody else is doing. If you do that, then you need to make up for it in marketing. You need to somehow differentiate yourself with some sort of standout guerrilla marketing. You see this a lot in sort of the produce or not produce, maybe the juice industry, where you'll see lots of different companies making juices or things you see on store shelves in grocery stores that aren't really that different. They taste slightly different, but whatever, it's all pretty tasty. But then they'll just try to market themselves in crazy ways. Some will be the like the healthiest possible juice, right? And it's all whole packaging is all about how healthy it is, and there's no GMOs, et cetera, et cetera. Like some of the stuff is kind of bullshit. It's not even the stuff that really is unhealthy, but they just like put it on there to really appeal to you and like market themselves that way. So if you have a really truly undifferentiated project or product, you can still succeed if you like really differentiate yourself with the marketing and the way that you present yourself. But if you're entering a crowded market, I would recommend that you do differentiate your product. You pick maybe a niche, people who have a specific thing that they're really into that they really like, and then build sort of a product just for them. Right? Indie Hackers looks different than Facebook because Facebook needs to appeal to everybody. So they build features that appeal to everybody, whereas I need to appeal to basically developers who are trying to build companies. And so I can build features that appeal to them that Facebook is never going to build, that other social networks are never going to build because it's not their wheelhouse. And so I'll always have a competitive edge because I've chosen kind of a niche within a crowded market.
So how niche-y is too niche-y? You know, I have weird hobbies. I'm sure everyone does. But, you know, how do I know that the underwater basket weaving community is one that could be monetarily interesting at some point in the future, or if it's just a fun, basically charity act?
I think there's two questions in there. One of them is how niche is too niche. In other words, like how small and business speak is the market, right? They're not like how many people are actually going to pay for this. And then there's also like the value of the problem you're solving, right? You can have a huge market with millions of people, but if the problem you're solving is not that valuable, those people won't pay you any money for it or very little money, and you still don't have a business. And so you need both of those numbers to be somewhat substantial. Otherwise, it's really hard to make any kind of business at all. So underwater basket weaving, let's evaluate the market of underwater basket weavers, right? Like how many of them are there? That's the question you should try to find the answer to. Like you don't have to be exact. You need to estimate within like a couple orders of magnitude what sorts of problems underwater basket weavers have, right? Is it that they need underwater basket weaving equipment? Do they need scuba gear, right? Do they need lessons or instructions for underwater basket? Do they want to connect to other underwater basket weavers? Do they just want a place to like show their projects off? Those are all very different problems, right? People are probably very likely, if you're into underwater basket weaving, to pay for the materials you need to build an underwater basket. You kind of need those, right? Those probably are kind of expensive. And if you can make a better version of those baskets or a better kit to put those baskets together, then you can definitely make money from underwater basket weavers. Whereas underwater basket weavers sharing photos of their baskets probably doesn't make them any money, probably not a necessary activity, probably something that they can skip even if they really love it. And so maybe you'll get a lot of users if they find what you're doing useful, but will they pay you money for it? I doubt it. So in that situation, you'd have to find an alternative business model.
So that's pretty nuanced right there. Because on the one hand, we have this niche community. On the other hand, it sounds like there are different ways of serving them that might be good or bad decisions for me if I'm trying to make this a business.
Yeah.
So I could have this thriving underwater basket weaving photo sharing app, but really struggle in the future and not realize it until I try to make some money off of that. Is this something you have to think of on day one? Like have some sense of how this eventually generates cash for you? Or can you bolt it on later? Or does it
don't need to think of it from day one. In fact, you can probably find many hundreds of stories of people who stumbled into what later became a profitable business idea. But I heavily advise that you do think about it from day one. I think the survivorship bias of people who've built products that are successful is very risky to only read about the survivors and not realize how many people may have tried it the same way but failed. I think the vast majority of people who just stumble into a business idea don't succeed compared to a much higher percentage of the people who succeed when they really sit down and they're disciplined about it. We've been going into lots of tactical details in this conversation, and it might sound overwhelming. It might sound like a lot, but quite frankly, if you're a developer, really, if you've gone to college and graduated, you've already learned many more complex things than the concepts we're talking about. We're talking about things that you could sit down and read a couple books about and grasp the basic details, the most common mistakes, the most common pitfalls, make a checklist so you don't forget, and then go on your way. The real difficult part, I think, is just the discipline. Most people aren't disciplined. They know what to do. They've read what to do. They know the 10 or 15 or 20 things you need to know, but they ultimately go out and just build a product for a really small market, or they go out and build a product that they don't really enjoy working on and then wonder why they want to quit a year or two later, or they build something that's too substantial and it takes forever to launch, or they never talk to their customers. Like there's not that many tips, but they're important to follow. And so I frequently run into situations where, founders failed a lot. They weren't successful over long periods of time. And then they hit some sort of constraint where they were going to run out of all the money in their bank account, or where they put themselves under some sort of pressure, and that forced them to be more disciplined and be like, okay, I know what to do. Let me stop messing around and actually do the things I need to do. And that's happened to me as well.
So I'm on board with selling to businesses. It makes sense. They have deeper pockets than your standard consumer. But businesses come in a lot of different shapes and sizes.
They do.
I mean, the dentist across the street is a business, and so is the huge tech company in South Bay. They're all businesses. So is there any nuance there between which one I should probably go after?
It really depends on your industry. I think it's really important that you mention that businesses come in all shapes and sizes, because I think one of the reasons why people are so afraid to sell to businesses is because they think immediately enterprise sales. If I'm going to sell to a business, I somehow need to sell to Google, which means I need to do all this work to figure out the right person to call in Google and put together a sales presentation and know all these enterprise sales skills, et cetera, et cetera. Well, like you said, businesses come in all shapes and sizes. There's lots of individuals. There are lots of other indie hackers who are themselves businesses. If you're at all questionable about selling to businesses, what I recommend is start a business and sell to consumers. Just build a consumer product. And in the course of running that business, I guarantee you in the first month or so, you're going to make a bunch of purchases as a business yourself. You're going to pay for Google Apps so that you can have your own, domain name and email address. You're going to pay for web hosting probably. You're going to pay for some development tools. You're going to pay for all the stuff that you need. And there's going to be some problems that you probably want to solve with your business that there aren't tools that exist for you to solve. You're going to be like, man, I'm really trying to build this underwater basket weaving social network, but there just isn't, a really good product for building, a photo sharing app, and then you realize, lots of other businesses just like me are trying to build a photo sharing app. What if I made a framework for easily launching your own white labeled photo sharing app that any business could build? And so I think if you try to start a B2C business, you'll firsthand experience just how easy it is as a business to make purchases. And that'll give you ideas for businesses that you can start to sell to other businesses, if that makes sense.
I think it does, yeah. So the idea of selling freaks me out. I mean, I'm a developer, so is this audience. Most likely, as a developer, you're probably pretty introverted and you love the idea that if you build it, they will come. So how do I get over this fear of not wanting to sell to people or talk to anyone? I just want people to buy my thing that I had coded.
It is very unusual to start a company where if you build it, they will come. I don't have any particular tips for getting over the fear of doing it the opposite way and talking to people. I think you just have to do it. But I'll reiterate something I mentioned earlier on when I said that everybody's really already a business. Like, you're already doing sales. If you're a developer, you're already talking to members on your team and convincing them to do things, build the architecture your way. You're already interviewing at companies and convincing them to pay you for your services instead of your competitors. You're already doing sales all throughout life. And sales really aren't, it's not that hard, doesn't it? You don't even have to do it like on the phone. You don't have to walk door to door. With Indie Hackers, when I first started doing ad sales, I talked to another podcaster who was a friend of mine who had already done a bunch of ad sales. And I was like, hey, how did you do this? And he's like, oh, here's a list of the people that I emailed and they sponsored my podcast. And so then I just emailed those people. If you're a developer, it's not that scary to send an email to somebody. I kept it brief. I said, hey, my name is Courtland. I run this online community of developers starting businesses called Indie Hackers. They would love to use your product. I'd love to get it in front of them. Would you like to inquire further about how you could potentially sponsor a newsletter and website, et cetera? It's just a brief email. I didn't have to talk to anybody. So it wasn't that scary because I sent so many of these, the fear of rejection wasn't that bad. And what happened was, because I had these good email addresses, ultimately people responded. And I was talking directly to people in the companies whose job it was to take this $1 million budget that they were bestowed upon and literally spend it on ads. And so none of them were taken aback by the fact that I suggested that they spend ad money on my website or my podcast. And so most often, what happened was they would call me and they would just want to talk on the phone about their kids and their vacations and whatever. And they'd be like, here's $5,000. Here's what our podcast ad should say. Run it by me after you record it. And it was super easy. And I've heard this story time and time again from lots of different founders, especially when they're selling things that people certainly want. So I was selling ads. That made it significantly easier. I was selling ads to people, as I just said, whose job it was to buy ads for their company. Key Value is a company I mentioned earlier several times. She's basically selling job descriptions on a job board, right? Companies pay for that. They have recruiting departments and hiring departments that have a budget set out for that. So when she calls people, they don't think it's crazy. They generally say yes and ask her different questions. Where people run into more trouble is when you're trying to sell basically a solution that you haven't validated, like some sort of totally novel product that no one's ever built before, no one's ever seen before. And you have to not only sell it, but you have to first educate people as to what it is and how it's going to be valuable to them. I'm not saying that can't work. That sort of true innovative play has worked time and time again, but it's just harder. It's scarier. You're going to get a lot more rejection. It's just a more difficult path than selling something that people already were kind of used to buying.
So this is all really great. I mean, I think that, I'm pretty inspired to start something myself.
You should.
Suppose I do. and I go at it for a few years, and it's okay, it's doing all right, but it's not doing well enough to justify the opportunity costs of not being safely employed at some cushy tech job. When should I quit?
Good question. God, I feel like I have such long-winded answers to every one of your questions. I have a long-winded answer to this one as well. So let's go back to my childhood, Andy. I played a lot of video games growing up. I was obsessed with video games. I also wrote a lot of code, played sports, and I was generally pretty good at a lot of the stuff. Like, I'm pretty good at video games. And what I realized in going into startups was that I'd always thought that like what made me good at these things was that I worked hard. I was just obsessive. I have an obsessive personality, so I'd play video games for like 10,000 hours of StarCraft or something. And it's like, it's no surprise that I'm good. But what I realized later on is that it's not just about working hard. It's also about having a really good feedback loop. If you're playing a video game, for example, what happens is you lose and you realize why you lost and you play again. If you're playing sports, the same thing happens. If you're in a startup and you have one idea that you're working on for a long time, like, you might not be getting that much feedback. In fact, you can easily, as a developer, sit down and code something for 9 months straight, not talk to anyone, not attempt to make a single sale, release your product. By that point, you've run out of money in your bank account or things are stressful, and then you get your first no, and you've got to shut down and get another job. And in that case, your feedback loop, you literally only had one revolution through that loop. So you didn't have much of a chance to learn. And so your question was, how do I know when to quit if something's been puttering along for a long time? My advice is to avoid getting into that situation to begin with by basically making sure you have something with such a quick feedback loop that you are pretty sure it's not going to work really early on. And this is something that I think takes a tremendous amount of discipline. I'm not that great at it myself, but the times where I have been great at it, it's worked the best. So I've had businesses, products that I built that literally never made more than a few $100s a month in revenue for like 4 years and just kind of puttered along. And I was like, I'm going to build this feature and that feature. And I have all these grand plans for how it's eventually going to be good, but it just never materialized. I also started other websites like Indie Hackers that were successful 3 weeks after I had the idea. My bias now, having talked to so many people and interviewed so many founders and developers building their own projects, is to only work on things where you can get some sort of basic version out the door and start selling it in like 2 to 4 weeks. Like, embrace that constraint. That doesn't mean you can't build anything ambitious. It just means that if you're going to do something ambitious, you need to start with an extremely pared down version of that. Like Peter Levels' Google spreadsheet instead of his website for nomads, right? It just started off as like providing the same value, just in a really stripped down, easy to build form. Work on that. Publish it on the channels where you think it's going to get a lot of traction. Try to sell it to the people you think will be interested in it. Get that feedback immediately, right? If you see that they're interested in it, then invest additional time. And if you see that they're not, move on to another idea. Same guy, Peter Levels, famously launched an initiative he called 12 Startups in 12 months, where every month he came up with a new idea, launched a new startup, tried to promote it, saw how it did. Some of them were like total failures. Some of them were like kind of okay, but he was going through the feedback loop so rapidly that he got a lot of information that like a lot of people might not get in 2 or 3 years of work. And so when he eventually built Nomad List, the response was so much higher than like the 7 startups he had built the 7 months previously that he could recognize it as an outlier success. And it was very easy for him to say, okay, this is what I should double down on and stick with. For me and Indie Hackers, it took me like 7 years to do that 7-month process for him, right? It took me like 7 years to start and fail 7 startups. And then when I started Indie Hackers, I said, oh, I've done so many things in the past. None were this big, but it would have been much better if those things were like way smaller and I went through a feedback loop way faster so I could have learned. So my advice is don't let yourself get into that situation in the first place where you're sort of struggling with one business that's limping along for years or months and months and months. Like, call it quits before that. Start something new. It's hard. Like I said earlier, like there's a lot of discipline it takes to do this because you're going to want to not dump your baby. And it seems like crappy to get started with something new. And you're also going to find stories out there of people who have struggled with one business idea for 3 years and eventually made it work. And those stories will be inspiring and they'll convince you that you should do the same thing. Again, I think that's survivorship bias. Just because it's worked for some people doesn't mean it's going to be your best chance going forward. So I would advise you do the opposite approach. Do really quick, small things. Try to get wins there. And then once you have a small win, what's really cool is that makes it easier to get to the next one. It's like climbing a staircase, right? It's much easier to get to the second step if you take the first step because like the additional height you've gotten makes the next step easier. With Indie Hackers, I didn't start with a community forum or a podcast. I started with just interviews on a website. Those interviews made it easy for me to get traffic because people like to share links to interviews online. That traffic helped me build a mailing list. That mailing list helped me build a community because then I've got people I can email every single week and say, hey, check out this community over and over and over again until the gears started turning and started building, some steam. And so it's like literally like that's 4 steps on a staircase. And I could not have just jumped to the 4th step if I didn't start small. So that's my long-winded answer to your question of when should you quit?
Well, that was awesome. So from what I gather, well, first of all, backing up a bit, there seem to be two schools of thought when it comes to this when to launch question. On the one hand, you have the lean startup school of thought, which is that you should launch your MVP or minimum viable product basically as soon as possible. Kind of what you said. And, 2 to 4 weeks, just get that yes or no, that instant feedback loop as soon as you can. And then on the other hand, you have the school of thought that says, look, first impressions are critical. And you only have one first impression with your customer. And if you blow that, they're going to churn from your site and never come back. So those seem to be at odds with each other. And so based on what you've seen and heard and all your indie hackers experience, what tends to ring truer?
It depends on the size of the audience you want to reach with that first impression. Generally speaking, there are more people in the world than you're ever going to be able to show your product to, than you're ever going to be able to talk to. Even if you pick a small market, there's probably more people in that market that will ever see your product than you can imagine, which means that you can afford to have like kind of a bad impression on a few of those people. It's not the worst thing in the world. I've been affected by this where I didn't want to launch something because I thought it was embarrassing and it wasn't good enough and I needed to add another 6 months worth of features before I felt good. In fact, I was doing exactly what I said you shouldn't do and building a to-do list app, which sort of locked me into the cycle where I needed to do 10 years of development to catch up to the other to-do list apps. I think it's much better to just get that feedback, get the negative feedback, build something that's really small, really tiny, kind of crappy, and get into people's hands and see what they think about it and then iterate from there. It's much better than worrying too much about your first impression. And here's the thing, like if you're building a business, you're trying to sell somebody something, right? You're trying to give them something that's valuable. People don't say no because they don't like you. And they don't say yes just because they like you. They generally say yes because they find what you're doing is valuable. And so if you build something crappy and people don't like it and tell you why, and then you go back to the drawing board and make it better and talk to those same people again, and it's good, they're not going to not buy it because they had a bad impression the first time. They're going to be like, oh shit, this is really good. I'm going to use this every day. This happens all the time. Like tons of businesses started out really crappy and just iterated on their product. And people who said no earlier on decided to go back and give it a second chance. Now, we have to be careful, I think, is with this concept of launching. There are a few channels online where you can sort of post a link to the website that you've built or an app that you've created and ideally get many thousands of people in the door. But those channels generally don't let you post every week, right? They give you one shot and that's it. In those situations, I think if you've only got one shot, then you should be a little bit more reserved with when you take that shot. You should have a very clear objective of I'm going to launch my product on Product Hunt or on Hacker News or any of these websites because I've talked to lots of different customers at this point already and sold it to many of them. And I know that the masses are going to like it. So I'm ready to go to the masses. It shouldn't be your first sort of, I'm too scared to talk to anybody, so I'm just going to work on this for 9 months and then lazily throw it on to Hacker News and hope it blows up. It shouldn't be your first go-to thing because you're not going to get that many shots on goal with one of those big channels. It's pretty rare. The other thing I'll say about this is there's this concept of an MVP, which you were mentioning. There's also this concept invented by Jason Cohen, one of my favorite indie hackers. He's just like a grand wizard of indie hacking. He's bootstrapped 4 different businesses to over $1 million in revenue. And with his latest one, he decided to raise money, and now it's at like $200 million in revenue. Anyway, he has this concept of an SLC, which he calls a simple, lovable, complete product. And so the analogy he always draws is like, okay, what you want to do as a founder is you want to build a car. You see a Ferrari, you're like, I want to build my own Ferrari, but you don't have the resources or the time to build this Ferrari. And so what you end up doing is making all sorts of cuts. You're like, oh, it's not going to have a steering wheel today because I can't afford to put it. It's also not going to have air conditioning. I'll just make a really janky version of like the braking. Sometimes the brakes will fail. And then you build this crappy Ferrari nobody wants. And you try to release that and see what people think and then give you all this predictable feedback of how it's missing all these features. Right? This is my to-do list app that like couldn't sync across devices and didn't have an Android app, et cetera. That's not what you want to do. Right? An MVP is not just like a full product that's crappy. Right? What you want to do is build an SLC, something that's super simple, lovable, and complete. And so instead of building a Ferrari, maybe you build a motorcycle. Maybe that's too complex. So you don't build a motorcycle, you build a scooter. Maybe that's too complex. So maybe your first version of your product is just like a skateboard. Right? You can build a skateboard and you can make it as good as another skateboard. And yeah, it's not the Ferrari that you want, but maybe if you build your skateboard and build a following for that, you'll get enough revenue to build your scooter next, and then build a motorcycle, and then build a car. So it's almost kind of like the stair-step approach that I was saying. And I think in that situation, you're much less likely to build something that people hate. You can just build the most stripped down, bare bones, simple feature that gets one job done and does it well. And if you have the discipline not to add a whole bunch of other features that are half-baked and just like deal with the fact that your customers are going to complain, why don't you do this yet? And why don't you do that yet? Just deal with it. If customers are saying that they want you to do more things, then that's a really good position to be in. That means that they love what you've built and they trust you to build other good things. Whereas if customers are saying that what you've built is crappy and they want you to fix it, then you probably started a little bit too ambitious and you need to pare down what you're doing.
So indiehackers.com was at one point an indie hacker business.
Yes.
When you look at that business, on paper, it looks freaking awesome. I mean, you started it and ran it for 9 months or so.
Yeah.
And then 9 months later, Stripe, of all places, acquires you. And that sounds like a fantastic outcome. Is that something that indie hackers should aspire to, is kind of being folded into some larger company and getting a nice, acquisition payday in the process?
I think it's an unreliable path to set out to try to accomplish. I think one of the best things, and one of maybe the signature elements of being an indie hacker, is that you probably don't like gatekeepers that much. For example, if you try to raise money, it doesn't matter how good your business idea is. It doesn't matter how charismatic you are. It doesn't matter how good a developer you are. You need this investor's money. And if they don't want to give it to you, then you're up the creek without a paddle, right? You're screwed. And so a lot of indie hackers don't like to raise money because they want to be in control of their own fate. Similarly, getting acquired is not something that you really have full control over, right? Your acquirer might have all sorts of things going on inside their company, reasons why they want to buy you, reasons why they don't want to buy you, and it's all black box to you. And so you can't really deliberately set out on day one to build a company that another company is going to acquire unless you have some sort of insider knowledge, or you're just something that I don't, quite frankly. And so for me, getting acquired by Stripe was total luck. That was never my plan. I got an email from the CEO of Stripe out of the blue when I was on vacation with my friends without expecting it whatsoever. Before that, I was actually generating revenue. I was on the phone with basically marketers at different companies, getting them to buy ads and sponsorships on my website. And I had just reached the point of profitability where I could pay for my rent and lifestyle and insurance and food every month, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing that I think people should aspire to do as indie hackers is to find some sort of success quickly. The thing you should copy from my story, if anything at all, is get to the point where you can generate revenue as fast as possible. I had my first advertiser 2 weeks after I launched Indie Hackers, which was 3 weeks after I came up with the idea for Indie Hackers. So there's very little lag between starting it and making money. That's what you should aspire to. I don't think you should aspire to some sort of 1 in a million lucky success story, because it's pure luck that Stripe happened to see Indie Hackers and want to acquire. That's not something that I planned on happening from the beginning.
What sort of conclusions then can you expect for an indie hacker business? Maybe an acquisition from a large tech company, not super common. But suppose, you've been at it for a few years, your indie hacker business has kind of run its course. What do you do after that? Is the only option to shut it down? Is there a notion of mergers in the indie hacker world?
Good question.
What can you do?
There's a lot of different options. I like talking to indie hackers who've been doing this for a long time. So I mentioned Natalie Nagel and her company WildBit. She's been doing this since 2002, I think. I talked to a guy named AJ Goyle. He started an email marketing business around the same time, early 2000s. Same time that MailChimp was started, actually. And MailChimp went on to become $1 billion company, and his business didn't. But it still made millions of dollars a year, and eventually he sold it. I talked to Peldy. He's got an online mock-ups business called Balsamic. So if you want to design an interface, you just sort of drag and drop components, pay him $30 a month for the service. All these businesses are making millions of dollars a year. All of them eventually hired teams. All of them got to the point where the founders themselves don't really have to do any work. They've got talented team members who can come in and handle customer support and handle development, et cetera. And each of these three founders has handled it slightly different. So AJ, the guy with the email marketing business, decided to sell his business. And he spent a year, which he says is the best year of his life, just living, just wandering in the streets, talking to people, having conversations with strangers, reading, learning. And then he got antsy. And he's like, I want to start another business. And I want to start a business that's different. I already made my money. I want to start a business this time that's going to be more impactful in the world. And he started another business. And that's the path that he's going down right now. Natalie from WildBit has never started another business. She's been working on the same business for the last 18 years. And they've launched a ton of different products under the same name, WildBit. And they're just interested in improving their lives and in sort of making WildBit a really cool place to work. So they're experimenting with a 4-hour work week. They are empowering their employees to work on all sorts of cool different projects and learn different skills on the job. And they have this almost I called it a utopian vision. Natalie didn't like that, but they got a utopian vision for what it's like to create a place to work. Because in a lot of ways, being a founder is like being the dictator of a small country. You set the rules. No one can tell you what to do. You can do whatever you want. You can allow your employees to do anything, create whatever rules you want, as long as it's not illegal. And so I think her and her husband, Chris, are just really fascinated and interested in making it the best business that they can and really breaking the rules in good ways to make it a great place to work for themselves and their employees and to create great products for their customers. The last person I mentioned, Peldy, he gave a really funny talk at a conference I went to last Boston, where he was basically struggling with this like crisis himself. So, Natalie has an answer and AJ had an answer, but Peldy didn't. He's like, what do? I've got all this money. I've got this cool company. I don't know if I really want to start another company, but I don't feel necessarily that great, like, separating myself from my business. I feel like my identity is wrapped up in my business. What do I do? I don't think he really particularly wants to sell it. So he's like literally just struggling to find that path himself. And he's been emailing all sorts of other founders to ask them for their perspectives and what they say. And he's got a lot of good quotes. So I think that talk is online somewhere. I don't remember all of the quotes that he was able to get from other founders giving advice. But the one that stuck out to me the most was someone telling him, make sure you're running towards something, not away from something. Don't just run away from your business because it's boring. Make sure you're running towards something you actually want to do that you feel energized for. But this is a very roundabout way to answer your question. There's no one path. You can sell your company. You can merge with another company. You can turn it into some sort of money-making machine while you go on and do more interesting things. Or you can work on it and really treat it as your own playground to create some sort of space for yourself and others to live the kind of life that you want.
So there's this narrative that for a lot of people, once they have that financial independence, life is good. That's kind of the end. You've got the money, so you never have to worry about it again. You've got, suppose you've got the house and the home of your head. All your needs are taken care of. You're basically at the tip top of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I would say that it seems like you're basically there from my perspective. Would you agree with that?
I don't know if I would say I am. It always seems like somebody else is there and you're not there. I don't know. To be like, if you're listening to this, you're probably a developer with a decent job in a first world country. Do you really feel like you're at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and there's nothing else that you really need? Like, probably not, because your peers are on the same level as you and you're looking up to people who are sort of that you want to aspire to be in a better situation. Like, we always have goals. Like, if you talk to Mark Zuckerberg, like, that guy probably has goals for where he wants to get. He's probably frustrated that he hasn't reached some goal that he really wants to achieve. I think it's turtles all the way down, man. That's always the case. Otherwise, any of us could just basically significantly reduce our standard of living and be set for life on developer salary in a much cheaper place.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if you know anyone who has found that nirvana, that fulfillment. Like, it seems like this indie hacker lifestyle, based on what I've heard, it's got all the ingredients. Does anyone ever make it?
I mean, that's basically what I'm saying. Like, the answer is no. I don't know anyone who's ever just been like, I've got everything that I've wanted, and now I'm just like Zen, and I'm just going to sit in a meditative pose on the beach for the rest of my life. Just like, I don't know anyone who's done that. Everyone is, especially if you're an indie hacker, you're probably kind of ambitious. You probably really like creating things. Like, the actual process of figuring out these challenges, these puzzles, of having a market that you're trying to sell to and trying to figure out what they like and what they don't like is actually really fun. And I think once you've gotten to a place, you're just going to ratchet up your goals. Like I mentioned, Jason Cohen, he's like, I've bootstrapped 3 businesses to $1 million. Now he's like, I'm going to raise a ton of money and just make a huge business. Like, did he have to do that financially to make his life better? Like, did he not, have enough money or enough successes under his belt? Like, I think it's just fun for him. Like, he really enjoys it. He feels fulfilled by doing it. That's not to say everybody takes that path. Like, I know people who've basically retired, but they've just gone on to other challenges. Like, they're trying to become novelists now. They're taking on new difficult things that are analogous to starting a business and that aren't easy, and they're starting from the bottom. So maybe it's something to do with our generation. Maybe I think millennials are less likely to want to just go retire on a beach somewhere. Maybe it's something to do with developers. Developers are people who like problem solving and puzzles and are never going to be satisfied without doing any sort of that thing and exercising their brains. But no, I've never met anyone who just said, I'm done and I've achieved everything I want.
Well, thanks a lot, Courtland. I think now we can sort of transition into a tradition we have on Business Logic that I'm just starting, which is the lightning round.
All right.
It's kind of self-explanatory. Every question ideally gets a fairly short answer. Let's start with your role model as a kid. Who'd you look up to?
Kenny G and Bill Gates. They were my dual role models. I played the alto saxophone and I loved programming computers and helping adults fix their computer issues. And so I was always split between whether or not I wanted to be a saxophonist or a software engineer. And eventually, luckily for my bank account, software engineering won out and I'm not playing my sax in the subway.
Vim or Emacs?
Neither. I use neither. I guess if I have to use one, I use Vim. Every now and then, but only as a convenience factor when I'm like in the terminal, I want to edit something quickly. I use basically VS Code for like all of my programming.
Very nice, me too. How about the best place you've ever visited?
South Africa, by far. So I went to Cape Town, South Africa 2 Januaries ago, and like I wasn't expecting that much. Actually, the very first guy that I interviewed on the Indie Hackers podcast lived there. And my girlfriend and I always liked going to places that were warm in January. So we're like, oh, let's go somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere. Let's go to South Africa. Like, throw a dart at the map. It was a nightmare getting there from California. It was like a 11-hour flight to London, a 2-hour layover, then an 11-hour flight to South Africa. So it's like a day to get there. But what was really cool is when you get there, there's like no Americans there. And every time anyone heard our accent, they were like, oh, Americans. They just wanted to talk to us about politics and Trump and whatever was happening at the time. They were super friendly. It was just this cool, like almost European city in Africa. And all the Africans I met there were from different countries. Like they weren't South Africans, they were just from everywhere. And then the other half of the population was like Europeans or like, I guess like native, like I think like the history was that the Dutch used to live in South Africa. So they speak Afrikaans. It was just a cool melting pot of lots of different people. They had a very interesting, controversial history with apartheid there, which I thought was cool, kind of cool to look into. The nature was beautiful. Amazing beaches, really good food, really cool hikes, all sorts of animals. There's a beach there with penguins on it, and you can just walk right up to the penguins and like you can't touch them because they'll bite you, but like, you could if you really wanted to. There's like monkeys and stuff, safaris not too far away. The food was delicious. It was about like a fifth the cost of San Francisco, so I could get like a steak, an appetizer, a dessert, a drink for like $20. And everyone was super nice and fun. Nightlife was cool too. So by far my favorite place.
What about your favorite quote, potentially from either Bill Gates or Kenny G?
I think my favorite quote comes from Ben Franklin, and this is not the full version, this is just part of it, but it's experience keeps a deer school, but a fool will learn and no other, and seldom at that. And what he means by that is that it's really good to learn from experience. Like there's no lesson you can learn deeper than a lesson that you've learned from experience. I can sit on here on this podcast and tell you all day what you should do and shouldn't do in your business, and you might be like, yeah, but you got to go out and make those mistakes, learn them on your own. And once you do, you'll really understand. But the second part of that quote, like a fool will learn and no other, it's like you still really want to learn from other people's mistakes. Like you don't want to live a whole life where you're having to make all the mistakes yourself, because that's a miserable life. That's a recipe for like a disastrous life. Like you need to some degree, find it within yourself to trust in other people's advice, even if you haven't made that mistake yourself, even if you haven't been burned. So I like that quote a lot. I try to live my life that way. It's hard. I made a lot of mistakes that people have warned me against, and I touched the hot stove, so to speak, but it's my favorite quote, I think.
What are you going to do when you retire yourself, Courtland?
I'm never going to retire. What does retire even mean? Like, what does that even mean? Like, what do you do? I think the cool thing about living in a digital age is it's not like the work that I love to do is like some sort of manual labor where like, my back's going to break when I'm old and I can't do it anymore. Like I'm a computer programmer. As long as I don't get crazy RSI, like I will always be able to type on a computer. And I'm sure the technology in the future will be such that even if I get old and blind or whatever, I'll still be able to figure it out. So I will probably be an old man on my computer writing code. And most of the other professions that I would enjoy dabbling in and learning are also like increasingly becoming digital. Like software is eating the world, right? If I want to be a writer, it's not like I need a typewriter or notepad. Like I'm still going to be on my computer typing away. If I want to be an animator, guess what? On my computer typing away. So what am I going to do when I retire? Like I'm never going to retire, but like there might come a day where I stop starting companies and start engaging in other projects. I really think it'd be cool to be a fiction writer. I think in a lot of ways it's similar to coding. You got to sit down and sort of craft this system, this basically, as a programmer, it's a system. As an author, it's a story. And you can tweak it over and over again before you show it to anybody if you really want to. And then you release this product and see if people like it. So I think that's really appealing to me. Other than that, I don't know. I like to travel more. I like to read a lot more. I really enjoy teaching. So a million different things. And probably every one of these is like a business. So probably every one of them will be a business, even though I like to say I'll get out of business someday.
That's really cool. I didn't know that you wanted to be a fiction writer someday.
Yeah, I love watching and reading fiction, and then I'm a critic. I'm that guy you watch the movie with, and I won't shut up about like the different things they could have done better, et cetera. I just like looking at like what was going on in the author's mind when they wrote this or made this, and so probably just due to karma, I think I owe it to the world to like actually try creating something like that myself and see how hard it really is.
That's really cool. Well, we'll be sure to have you on the show again when you're Courtland Allen, the author. But this has been great. If people here want to learn more about indie hackers or you, are there any books or podcasts, or what should they do on indiehackers.com? Like, where should they go next?
Indiehackers.com is the place to go. I highly recommend checking out the Indie Hackers podcast. There's a ton of great episodes, especially some of the later ones. So just jump right in. There's no reason to start at the beginning. Jump into whatever sounds interesting. I also recommend going to the website, clicking on the interview section, and just reading a few interviews. So if you're not a podcast person, which is surprising if you're listening to this podcast, check out the interviews on the website. There's a ton of stories, like 400 stories right now, where we've interviewed mostly software engineers about how they came up with their idea, how they got started coding it, how they were able to generate revenue. Everybody shares exactly how much money they're making. Sometimes it's a few $100s a month. Sometimes it's millions of dollars a month and everything in between. So I really recommend going and check out that resource. And if you like what you find, join the forum. It's right on the homepage. You can see all sorts of other indie hackers like yourself exchanging ideas and asking for feedback. And that could be you. So I look forward to seeing you on there.
Courtland Allen, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Andy.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Business Logic. If you enjoyed the show, I would really appreciate if you left me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Since we are a fledgling, brand new spring chicken of a podcast, every review has an outsized impact. If you didn't love the show or have any suggestions for me for how it could be better, please email me instead at andy@businesslogic.fm. That's it for this one. See you in the next. Cheers.